Our housing and climate change crises are taking a tremendous toll on everyday working people. Following years of heavy losses from climate-exacerbated natural disasters, insurers in states across the country are raising rates and pulling out of markets altogether. Just this week, Farmers Insurance announced that it will pull out of Florida. In Louisiana, 11 insurers have gone bankrupt in the last 2 years and 10 have left the state. And this is just the beginning. This problem will continue to grow worse each year, each decade, until the climate crisis is mitigated. This hearing also comes at a time of unprecedented housing unaffordability and homelessness. In 2021, the number of tenants with unaffordable rents reached an all-time high, with 49% of U.S. renters paying more than a third of their income on rent. Although homeownership is still a goal for many, it is increasingly unattainable when high rents hamper the ability to save for a down payment and home prices continue their meteoric ascent.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We were just watching a clip from my testimony before the House earlier this summer about climate change, insurance, and housing, just to set the tone as everyone makes their way into the room. So good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today for a conversation on housing displacement and climate change. My name is Caroline Nagy, and I am the Senior Policy Counsel for Housing, Corporate Power, and Climate Justice at Americans for Financial Reform Education Fund. Americans for Financial Reform Education Fund is a nonprofit coalition that strives to protect the public from financial harms caused by banks and other financial institutions, and promote financial regulations that can help build a more fair, equitable, racially just, and sustainable economy. Before we begin today's program, I want to take a moment to reflect and consider the many legacies of racism, violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together. It is critical that our dialogue begins with and honors those who have been historically and systemically disfranchised. To start, I am coming to you today from the ancestral lands of the Mohican people, also known as upstate New York, and I encourage folks on today's call to take a moment to learn whose ancestral land you are living on by visiting native-land.ca. I also want to recognize the longstanding and ongoing impacts of U.S. colonialism in Puerto Rico. While we'll be discussing how U.S. recovery laws impact Puerto Rico, it's important to recognize that for over 100 years, Puerto Rico has remained an unincorporated territory of the United States. Prior to U.S. and Spanish colonialism, Puerto Rico was known as Borican, the name given to it by its indigenous Taino people. So this summer, we saw unprecedented fires, heat waves, storms, and flooding that for many people really brought the climate crisis home for the first time. We also saw housing costs rise to new unaffordable levels in the last few months. Median rents across the U.S. have now surpassed $2,000 for the first time, and there's no longer any U.S. county where a worker earning a full-time minimum wage salary can afford a modest two-bedroom apartment. Because of our nation's history of segregation and racist housing and community development practices, climate hazards are not experienced equally. Rather, they perpetuate existing disparities in housing affordability and stability. In particular, people who are experiencing homelessness, people of color, seniors, and people who earn lower incomes are more likely to live in areas vulnerable to climate change threats and are less able to recover from the financial blows caused by extreme weather and disasters. Unfortunately, our affordable housing crisis is driving people further into harm's way in a climate sense. As we'll discuss here, whether it means moving into illegal basement apartments that are vulnerable to flooding or into exurban communities with high fire risk. To make matters worse, we've seen that climate change is, in effect, upending the risk calculus that our insurance system has been based on, resulting in insurer failure and pullouts, along with higher costs for consumers. Meanwhile, our disaster recovery programs have historically resulted in inequitable outcomes for people of color, renters, and low-income families, as we'll discuss further today. Today's conversation will explore the various dimensions of how the climate and housing crises are interrelated and examine how our disaster recovery, affordable housing, and financial institutions serve or don't serve our communities. And to do that, we have an incredible panel for you. We're going to hear from our esteemed speakers, all of whom I'm so grateful to be in the presence of. We're joined by Jake Bittle, the author of The Great Displacement, Climate Change and the Next American Migration. We're also joined by Ariadna Godreau Aubert, the founder and executive director of Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico. We're joined by Alan Myers, the founder and former executive director of Regenerating Paradise, and Sadia Rahman, deputy director of policy at Chhaya CDC. Following each speaker's remarks, we will take questions from the audience and then close. Folks can submit their questions into the Q&A box, and please note that tonight's briefing is being live streamed. We welcome the opportunity and responsibilities of learning with and being in community with all of you today. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our first speaker, Jake Bittle, whose new book, The Great Displacement, Climate Change and the Next American Migration, inspired today's conversation. So I'll pass it over to you, Jake.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And excuse me, everyone, if you hear some background noise. My upstairs neighbor, as he so often does, has chosen a rather inopportune time to vacuum his entire apartment. So in 2020, I started working on a book project, which I had intended to kind of document the present tense impacts of climate change in the United States. I didn't really know what those impacts were going to be. I just sort of wanted a corrective to the predominant form of climate reporting, which is either coverage of scientific studies or future projections. That's changed a lot since then, but at the time I felt like there was a lack of good reporting about what climate change was already doing to US households. And what I found after about a year or two of pretty intensive research in several states was sort of a few things. Like, I found that in the aftermath and during the course of these long climate disasters like sea level rise and drought, and also these big percussive disasters like hurricanes and wildfires, there's a sort of multiple different kinds of instability obtaining in communities that were vulnerable to these disasters, right? So one was like a physical instability at the level of infrastructure. So I was in communities in North Carolina that relied on extremely flawed and outdated levees that were liable to burst, during heavy rains. They hadn't been built up to standard. I toured, communities in Houston that had been built in regulatory floodplains, sometimes with the knowledge and consent of the government agencies who knew that they were letting developers build in places that were vulnerable to flooding. I had been in places in California where people had thrown up, houses in fire areas after decades of fire suppression by the U.S. Forest Service, underestimating the risk. And then, of course, there were a bunch of communities in the Southwest United States that were reliant on water infrastructure, which was highly sensitive to drought. So that was the physical instability. Then there was a kind of like institutional instability. So FEMA was drastically under-equipped to respond to the mounting pace of climate disasters. Insurers, as Caroline mentioned, were underselling insurance in California, or they were subsidizing insurance for flooding, in the case of the National Flood Insurance Program, so low that it was actually incentivizing development in flood-prone areas, right? And then, of course, mortgage lenders, they had some understanding of the risk of their portfolio, but when they did understand, they tended to like securitize it with Fannie and Freddie, sort of passing the problem on to someone else. And of course, like there was very, very little in what we would call climate adaptation spending in the United States at that time. FEMA and the Department of Housing and Urban Development had done some sort of experimental grants on this stuff, but American cities and towns weren't really spending anywhere like the amount of money they needed to on infrastructure that could prepare for the effects of climate change, right? So hardening homes against wildfire, or building seawalls and living shorelines, or potentially moving people out of the way by buying out their homes, right? So the third kind of instability was like a personal instability at the level of the household. Not only did people have virtually no understanding of how the disaster recovery process was supposed to work or how it did work, they also didn't really understand the risks that they were living among. Like, they didn't know that they lived in a floodplain. They didn't understand what a high fire risk zone was. They didn't know where their water came from. And then, they didn't have enough equity in their homes in many cases, or they didn't have any equity in their homes sufficient to rebuild after a disaster, right? So they hadn't bought enough insurance, or they, they were renting, so they didn't have insurance at all. And after the disaster, there was just no way they could get, back to their home. They just could not afford to rebuild, right? Especially when construction costs were so excessively high. So, in sum, all these forms of instability, I sort of arranged the book around the question of climate displacement, or, what some people call climate migration, because the predominant consequence of climate change, or so it seemed to me, was housing displacement, right? And there's maybe a little bit of a hammer and nail thing, because I started reporting on housing and homelessness before I reported on climate change. But it really did seem like, more than death or sickness, or as much as those things, certainly most people who experienced, they were on the front lines of climate change, they were losing their homes. They were being pushed out of their homes, or housing was becoming more expensive, more scarce, harder to access than it was before. So I chose the term displacement for the title of the book because there's a kind of large and growing conversation about climate migration in the media and in international politics especially, which I thought was kind of inadequate to describe the movement that I was seeing, right? So migration, implies an intentional, one-directional motion from point A to point B. Usually it's voluntary, right? That's what the word connotes, at least. And displacement, which is a ubiquitous word in housing studies, as many as you know, probably it captures this chaotic sense more. So people would move and then move back, or they would move several times, or they would live with the. In any case, right, it was just much more chaotic. So I thought that word was really, really appropriate to catalog the movements that I was seeing in the United States as a result of that instability. So the book goes, all over, from North Carolina, California, Bay Area, Louisiana. But the three other speakers on this panel, actually, I'm really excited about it because they've covered, three of the disasters that aren't actually in the book, but I think are the most important three disasters in the United States recent history. One is the consequences of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. One is the Camp Fire, which destroyed the town of Paradise. And the other is the remnants of Hurricane Ida, which caused drastic flooding in New York City, where I live, in quite unexpected ways. So I'm really, really excited to hear from them. And I think that, in wanting to document the real time effects of the climate crisis, these are three people who are really, really close to those things and can speak to it even better than I can. So with that, I'm going to send it over to Ariadna, who's going to talk about Puerto Rico.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm really grateful just to be here. I am the founder and director of Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico, and since Hurricane Maria hit the island, we have been leading not only the part that has to do with disaster response, the legal part, but also what has to do with public policy regarding displacements and this idea of managed retreat, and how would that play out in an island with the circumstances that Puerto Rico is going through. I echo a lot of the things that Jake was talking about FEMA, about like the government. And when I'm talking about the government, in the case of Puerto Rico being a colony, I'm talking about the local government, but I'm also talking about the U.S. government, which is highly responsible for that framework that has to do with who gets access to disaster assistance and who gets denied. What was evident was that when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico in September 20th, 2017, the government was not ready to prevent, to prepare, to mitigate, to manage the consequences of this catastrophic event. We're talking about more than 700,000 houses that were impacted or destroyed by the passage of Hurricane Maria in an island that was already fragile in the infrastructure and in the capacity of people to be able to prepare or to have the necessary supplies to survive the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. And I think that when we're talking about, this idea of climate change and this idea of disasters, for me as a human rights lawyer, and somebody that's working constantly with litigation, but also advocacy, it's important to understand that disasters like climate crisis have backdrops. They have several backdrops. In the case of Puerto Rico, those backdrops have to do with colonialism. They have to do with systemic racism, with the way that Puerto Ricans have been treated by the U.S. constantly, a situation that was highlighted by that image of former President Trump, throwing paper to people that were actually awaiting water and medicine and supplies. It's also having a background that has to do, or a backdrop that has to do with austerity, with unsustainable public debt, which is a justification to start shutting down essential services that become highly key elements of the capacity of people to survive disasters. One of the things that happened in Puerto Rico was that in the aftermath of Maria, the people who died as a direct consequence of the disaster, who died because of the winds, because of the floods, or people who died because they were lacking energy. We had a power outage that in many parts of the island lasted 6 months, and in some places up to 1 year. We're talking about people who died because they lacked like the essential equipment that they needed to have their health cared for. And one of the first things that happened was that the government, a lot of people said back then, the government collapsed. But the government never collapsed. What happens is that the government prioritizes something that has nothing to do with mitigation, and the government started like enforcing like these curfews and abolishing like a lot of the protests that went out of the streets of people just like demanding food or access to water, or protesting the fact that because of the colonial relationship with the U.S., the aid that was arriving from other countries in the world was actually rotting in the ports because the U.S. wouldn't let it into Puerto Rico. And also the fact that the government, one of the first things that they did was denying the death toll of the hurricane, as if that would mitigate somehow the consequences of this catastrophic disaster. So as that is happening, what happens is that also disasters, when their consequences are neglected, they have a continuity, and that continuity has to do, of course, with climate change. In the case of Puerto Rico, which is an island in the Caribbean, we're talking about very severe weather, sea level rise, constant heat, more severe and more frequent hurricanes. We're also talking about displacements. We're talking about the fact that 17% of the people has left the island in the last decade. And it also has to do with disaster capitalism. So if we have the chance to speak about equitable chances of recovery, I think that all of these elements should also be part, of this broader conversation. With that being said, I think it's Sadia's moment to speak.
Yeah, thank you, Ariadna. And thank you, AFR, for the opportunity to have this like really important conversation. I think this afternoon it's just so fascinating to hear everyone speak. So I'm the Deputy Director of Chhaya CDC, which is a 23-year-old organization based in the heart of Queens, New York, that serves the South Asian and Indo-Caribbean communities through a combination of direct services and advocacy and community organizing campaigns. I currently lead the New York City-based campaign, and BASE is an acronym. It stands for Basement Apartments, Safe for Everyone. The campaign basically's goal is to seek to pass a comprehensive package of legislation at both the state and the city levels that will allow homeowners to opt into a program where they can get grants to convert their basement or cellar apartments into safe and affordable rental housing. The campaign started about 15 years ago when Chhaya noticed that for working class South Asians and Indo-Caribbean folks in our communities, the homeowners were struggling, right? They were in the middle of a financial mortgage crisis, needed extra income, had basement apartments that could be rented out, but they were illegal basements. And so they couldn't sort of claim that income on their sort of refinancing applications because of, these illegal basements. And at the same time, the policy of the city, and it is still the policy of the city today, was enforcement and policing. And so while homeowners were sort of suffering financially, tenants were being evicted by the Department of Buildings, who's coming around giving homeowners fines and locking the doors and locking tenants out of their apartments. And so we sort of identified this need to create a policy campaign that would allow homeowners to legalize their basements, get some government grants to do sort of the retrofitting that's necessary to make them safe, and then simultaneously create affordable and safe housing for tenants. And so it's been 15 years of sort of trucking along and trying to get the political will and buy-in to do this. But before I sort of go more into, I think, where the campaign is today and after, in the aftermath of Ida, I just want to give folks a little bit of a flavor of what I'm talking about when we're talking about affordable housing in New York City. So there's a crisis nationally to access affordable housing for working class folks and working poor folks. In New York City, probably one of the most acute places, if not the second most acute sort of crisis points in the city, in the state, in the country. So I Googled this yesterday. The average 1-bedroom apartment in New York City right now is $4,000. The average 2-bedroom apartment in the nation is $1,500. So a 1-bedroom in New York City, the median is $4,000. If you go on Zillow or Trulia right now and search 1-bedroom apartments in Queens, and then sort your search from low to high, the first 10 to 20 apartments that come up in Queens, they're below $2,000, are all sellers, and many of them don't have windows, they're subterranean. So that's our affordable housing stock, right? Like that's the lowest end of what you can get on Zillow or Trulia is a basement apartment at about $1,500 a month. And so for folks with limited English proficiency, folks who work minimum wage cash jobs, they don't have guarantors, they don't have big credit histories. This is the available housing, these illegal basements. And so right now, where we stand today, is that these basements are dangerous, right? These apartments are prone to flooding, and we saw that in Hurricane Ida 2 years ago. 11 people died in basement apartments. 10 of them were in Queens, 1 was in Brooklyn, and all of these apartments were not near a body of water. They were all victims of inland flooding. And so that's really sort of the problem that we're grappling with, right? It's, we're just trying to make things safe in addition to creating and expanding our affordable housing stock in New York. And so the campaign really is seeking to sort of move the needle on this and try to prevent more deaths from happening and sort of allow the state and the city to create a program where homeowners can opt in, and we can actually sort of increase affordable housing stock and make things safe for folks. So with that said, I'm going to pass it to Alan to go next.
Thanks, Sadia. Hi, everybody. First, I just want to thank you all for taking the time to be here today. You're here because you care about the climate crisis, you care about housing, and so my deepest gratitude to you all. I'm from Paradise, California, and when I would say that growing up, people would often think that I was making it up, making a joke or something. But now it has a very different connotation, as you know. For my time here, I want to share a little bit about the crisis in that way. We're all calling in from a sheltered place, most likely, and we're also calling in with the capacity to have a conversation. We're not living in the crisis. So for us to really act, it is my belief that we must feel it in a way that we're not. Growing up in Paradise, you could count on the rains in October. And on November 8th, 2018, things had already drastically changed. We had hot, dry winds that were blowing at 50, upwards of 100 miles an hour at Jarbo Gap. And a corporate power company, PG&E, had a utility line that was scheduled 2 decades before to be replaced. A hook broke in these high winds and sparked the deadliest wildfire in California's history. 86 people in my community died that day. There were 14,000 homes that vanished in a single day. 50,000 people would be displaced for over a month. In that moment, people were driving out, fearing for their lives, and picking up neighbors. And we learned in that moment that our greatest insurance policy wasn't the one that we had signed, but it was the one that we built with our neighbors, the social fabric, neighbors helping neighbors get out alive, and then the community surrounding Paradise that took in residents. And this lasted for a period of time. You know, cleanup crews came in, FEMA came in with the mandate in a way to bring Paradise back to what it was. But for real healing to take place, we needed to create something new. If we go back to what it was, then the question is, well, what the hell was that for? What did I go through that for? We're not addressing the underlying issues. And what we saw after the fire is there was about 4 groups that formed. These are folks that all went through the same experience but chose different paths. My parents, for one, were in the first group. Get me out of here. I never want to go back. I don't have the capacity to rebuild. It's too painful. They're in Southern California. There's campfire survivors in every state. Another group, they said, no fire's kicking me out of my town. They go back with their blueprints to rebuild exactly what was. And these are people that are then in decision-making positions. They're in the town council, and they're wanting to go back to the way things were. And then there's another group that's asking the question, what is this moment asking of us? How can we do things differently? And they're sticking around and they're waiting and seeing. And then there's a fourth group that if they could do anything, they would. If they could have the capacity to dream, they would. If they could rebuild, they would. If they could leave, they would. But they are so financially insecure and so marginalized that they don't have the capacity. They're just day by day. And these folks are now, you know, quote unquote, the homeless problem in the Bay Area or Chico. Recently, a study was done, Continuum for Care, that found that in 2021, a third of the homeless population in neighboring Chico were campfire survivors. So we could not guarantee housing for folks affected by the disaster. I have friends that were in FEMA trailers that were meeting with FEMA employees, caseworkers every day, and they were asking them, when are you going to get out of here? Have you got a job? Did you find a place to rent? We need to move you out. So the crisis for housing and the crisis of the climate crisis are very tightly woven. And we're seeing it in this moment. I have friends that are living it right now. And I appreciate you all for being here, curious about how we can solve this. And with that, I will pass it back to Caroline. Thank you so much.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing, Alan. And I think what you said about the real insurance policy being the community bonds, is so profound. So we're going to start with some Q&As. So, we have some, just amazing diversity of experiences and knowledge here. So please put those questions in the Zoom chat. And while we're waiting for questions, I'm going to start with some of my own for Jake. So Jake, your book is obviously very timely after our summer of a lot of natural disasters that I think has kind of changed the conversation in a lot of ways for a lot of people. One of your major focuses is the role of financial institutions like banks and insurers in supporting recovery efforts. Can you tell me more about the role of these institutions in recovery and specifically like where they fall short?
Yeah, so I think it's probably instructive to focus on insurers because the banks can be kind of arcane, but maybe we'll just start with insurance, right? So FEMA, spends billions of dollars after disasters to help people recover, right? Like they pay for temporary housing and sometimes they reimburse local governments who want to rebuild stuff like roads or power lines or whatever. But the vast majority of, actual aid, if you want to call it that, and it goes to homeowners through their insurance policies. Like that's the one of the largest volumes of money that gets dispersed after these disasters. And I think what we've seen, it's a little bit different in every state and with every disaster, but what we've seen is that, in general, the companies and entities that are offering that those policies and that, are basically the de facto recovery agents in those places have, definitely underestimated the current scale of risk from climate change, right? So the National Flood Insurance Program, for instance, a federal program that offers flood insurance to about 5 million people because the private insurance don't really offer it. like that program is about $30 billion in debt right now because the overall payouts from flood damage keep outpacing the scale of premium revenue that comes in, right? So then in California, right, we've seen several large insurers say that they're going to get out of the state or, cancel thousands of policies because I think the statistic is that in 2018 and 2017, the total claims payouts in those years from the private insurance industry in California after the wildfires wiped out like a quarter century of underwriting profits, right? So it just, the traditional model of insurance where you take in the premiums, right, and then you pay out the claims sort of hinges on the idea that the premiums will be more or less equal to the claims over a long period of time. And we're just seeing that that's not really possible. And so like in my home state of Florida, like the insurance industry has gone into complete state of collapse after the last few hurricane seasons because of the escalating cost of reinsurance. But basically, like overall, right? So whether it's from not offering insurance, right, or from making that insurance too expensive, like the primary means of recovery for most people is now functionally out of reach in a lot of the nation's most populous states. And so like that, a lot of you guys probably already know that, but I think that raises like a big question of like, what do you do about that, right? So the regulators have some ability to like keep prices down or make people participate in the market. But the real question is like, how much do the taxpayers of a state want to subsidize the insurance policy holders, right? So if the companies can't make money or the program doesn't have stability, it's ultimately like the government that bails it out, and ultimately the government like is financed by taxpayers, right? So there's this big question of like the burden of the costs of climate change, and I think that like you're seeing that play out on a micro level through like an individual's insurance policy and the price signal of that policy. So like, I mean, the ultimate answer to your question is like, yeah, that's like the main way that most people recover, but like actually it doesn't really work. And the way to resolve that is really, really, really thorny. And it brings up a huge question of like the public burden of these climate disasters and who should absorb that over a long period of time. That doesn't sound like the answer to any question really, because it's more or less a question that I'm asking, but like that is more or less the state of affairs, I think.
Well, yeah, thank you, Jake. I think we often in the climate, when we talk about climate and finance, we often talk about the idea that you privatize the gains and you socialize the risk and the losses. And, this is kind of a situation that we've seen, where insurance companies have profited for many years until this disaster happened and have also invested in fossil fuels, and, as our partners in advocacy have pointed out. So for my next question, I would like to go to Sadia. And Sadia, I mean, you've told us, with your information about like what rents are right now in New York City and in Queens, I think it's pretty understandable why, at the national level, more folks are moving into disaster-prone areas and out of them. And that's because we have an affordable housing crisis. And we see this on a national scale, but also global with climate migration. And finally, even on a local scale, as in our communities and neighborhoods. So, as we all saw, the 2021 Hurricane Ida had really tragic consequences for your community, and once again raised the issue of the need for both affordable housing and for safe alternatives to illegal basement apartments. So can you tell me more about the housing needs of folks in your community who might find themselves living in basement apartments, and how can we better meet their needs?
Sure. I mean, it's a complicated question that I think a lot of sort of housing policy experts spend a lot of time trying to answer, and they're much smarter than me and are working on this, and they still haven't found a solution. So I'm not sure we know sort of what the right sort of formula is to sort of, but I think in terms of describing the problem, we need more deeply affordable housing in New York City, right? So development happens all the time, but development happens for luxury housing. And then when it comes to conversations about increasing affordable housing development, that's sort of when we start to have conversations about like no more density in my neighborhoods, right? And density becomes sort of like the sort of red herring in the problem. And I think what we really need to do is sort of have massive investment in making homes, developing more homes that are affordable. Like $1,500, a month is the lowest rent that you can find in Queens. And if the conventional wisdom is you make 40 times that in a year, that's still $60,000, right? That's twice as much as what somebody who makes minimum wage working 40 hours a week will make in a year. And so we really have to figure out how to create comprehensive and sort of a variety of initiatives to sort of build housing that makes sense for the folks at sort of the lowest tiers of the economy. And I think that is really a conversation that we've been having for a very long time, and we're just not getting sort of like the political will to sort of put a plan in place to create that kind of housing. And so I think that's really, really just sort of desperately what we need. And I think because I'm a tenant advocate, I'm a movement lawyer, I've been doing tenants' rights work, I will also say preserving the current affordable housing is also really important. And so, we have rent regulation in the city. It is, and we've made gigantic strides at sort of preserving affordable housing and the rent regulated housing in New York City, but it's still constantly under threat. And so just preserving what we got is also really important to sort of meet the needs of sort of working class folks, particularly immigrants, and particularly sort of the influx of migrants. Like, we're being told to think of this from like a scarcity perspective, and really we need to like have more open minds in terms of what we can do in New York City to house everyone.
Thank you so much, Sadia. Housing everyone in New York City should not be as much of a pipe dream, considering that it's one of the wealthiest countries in the world and the seat of global capitalism. And thank you for bringing up rent regulation and affordable housing preservation. This is a bit off of topic, but Americans for Financial Reform is a proud member of the Homes Guarantee campaign. And we've been making that argument as well, is that, as much as we desperately need to build more housing, and specifically affordable housing, we're losing more affordable units to rent increases than we can possibly build. And so our affordable housing response really needs to be mindful of, of the needs of people in already existing properties. So and housing, I know, is such I think housing is such an important issue as a climate issue, because this is really how people are going to feel the effects of climate change in a way that is a lot more, tangible, say, than, reading articles about, global temperatures or ice shelves. But now I'd like to pass it over to Ariadna, who's really, the experiences in Puerto Rico have been, just really demonstrated just how many negative consequences some of our disaster response policies and resources have, and specifically how they really do not adequately serve renters and lower income folks, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So Ariadna, what would a just disaster response look like in Puerto Rico? And what do we need to change about our current system to get there?
A lot of things, right? But I think that maybe like using a very concrete example could be good. When Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico and FEMA came into the island, one of the first things that happened, and that's something that already has happened in New Orleans and in other jurisdictions where people of color, Latinos, Puerto Ricans, Black community live, is that FEMA started like a very restrictive reading of the requirements, so that people could not access assistance if they lacked a legal document proving that they were owners of their land, of their houses. Just like figure out how many issues there are, like in the idea that having a colony and thinking that you have the complete power to say who's the owner of the land and who is not. So that's exactly what happened when FEMA hit the ground. The National Low Income Housing Coalition estimates that nearly 70,000 families were denied assistance based on the fact that they couldn't prove like ownership, even when nothing in FEMA criteria, in FEMA requirements, like demands people to actually have a legal document, and nothing in our local law requires, formal registration as a way to prove ownership. That basically snowballed. So when the earthquakes of 2020 came in, when the pandemic came in, the floods of 2021, and then another hurricane in 2022 came in, we still had people living on the blue tarps that had like a 90 days life, and that have been there like for 6 years now. So we're talking about, that added up fragility. I would say that a just recovery is a just recovery that has to do with people wants and needs. And we define also just recovery with this idea of human rights. Right now, uh, the region that's under the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights is reviewing regional standards to work with disaster response and to work with climate change. And what do we want to see in the next years about like what is an adequate response. And I'm thinking here about relocation with a human rights lens, talking about free, prior, informed consent for people living in coastal zones. There's no way that you can say that a place is too risky for a low income, but that it's a great target for people to develop hotels. So what we're talking about is about making it equitable and having a race and a class and a gender lens to the way that we are distributing assistance. And I also think it has to do with corporate accountability. A lot of the process of responding to disaster has been privatized. And disaster capitalism feeds off from that process. We have seen a rise of Airbnbs. We have seen a rise of the amount of land that it's an opportunity zone in Puerto Rico, which is 98% of the land. So what we're talking about is about tax breaks, it's about corporate accountability, it's about following the money, about where it's going and the places that people are living. And finally, I would say that a just recovery is a recovery that also have an equitable development lens. In Puerto Rico, they're pushing for the visitors economy scheme. And that's exactly what happens, as it's happening in Hawaii. That's what happens in the aftermath of a disaster when the government just basically like hands off the land to people that can profit from others people paying.
Thank you. Well, yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm going to next move to Alan. How can we balance our needs for housing affordability with climate resiliency? And what does that look like in Paradise?
Thanks. I love this question because I think if we really examine it, we can get to a real solution. And for me, it's not about how we can do affordable housing during the climate crisis. It's more about how can affordable housing contribute to the resilience of a community. So we know that we need housing. People need to be housed. We can all agree upon that. And we can all agree that the climate crisis is here. And how do we live with that? So one of the things that we are working at Regenerating Paradise is with our partners at UC Davis in examining those possibilities. So how can a community or home be built in a way that's affordable that also builds resiliency? And that might mean using local materials like earthen materials. We have a high clay content in Paradise, which then would be naturally fire resistant. It would look at how are we using our water resources, our energy resources, and flipping the idea that these are somehow separate and counter. They are forces that pull against each other. So for us, it's examining exactly that. How do we use our energy systems? How are we employing the community? And as Adriana pointed out, a lot of what happens after disaster are well-intentioned groups coming in with their best ideas of what should happen in a community, and they have the resources, so they're implementing them. Now, the community that lives with those decisions are often left out of them. So how can we bring the community that was affected by the disaster to be the developers, meaning we finance the community. We give them the resources that they need to come up with the solutions that they will then live with. And that's then also how we have transformative healing. Folks who lost their homes and are wondering, what was the point of this pain? Why did I go through this? If they aren't allowed to be a part of the recovery process and create something new, where at some point they get to look back and say, gosh, that was horrible what happened, but I'm really happy where I am now. And I'm really happy with what we discovered along the way.
Thank you, Ellen. Yeah, so I'm going to now start to take some questions from the audience. And there's so many. Yeah, you'll have some really great questions. So I'm going to start with, let's talk, actually, this is a question about Puerto Rico. And, noting that following Katrina, we saw a wave of gentrification and corporate consolidation of land ownership in New Orleans. And Ariadna, as you said, we've seen that also in Puerto Rico with more Airbnbs. What can you tell me about how climate displacement, how that happened following Maria, and also, given the U.S. colonial role in and racism towards Puerto Rico, what is the responsibility of those in the U.S. to remedy effects of climate disasters affecting Puerto Rico? So my first part, it's kind of a two-parter question, sorry. We'll start with, just climate and gentrification and corporate control of land. If you could, tell me a bit about how that happened.
We are seeing that in Puerto Rico, the rise of Airbnbs and short-term rentals have become a thing. The fact that you don't need a passport to come to Puerto Rico, but at the same time, it's this foreign experience, brought a lot of people during the pandemic. And what happened was that short-term rentals just skyrocketed across the island, raising the rents from 7 to 21% in different places. Also, we have seen more incentives for foreign investors. In 2012, the government approved these laws, Law 20 and Law 22, currently Law 60, which is under the investigation of the IRS, which basically brings to Puerto Rico foreign millionaire investors who only have to leave for half of the days of a year in Puerto Rico, and they get a complete tax break on capital gains. So Puerto Rico has become a tax haven for people who are interested in evading their fiscal responsibility. When these people come to the island, they have to buy a property to prove that they live here. So they buy from the luxury market. And remember that in Puerto Rico, I don't know if you know this, but the median income is $21,000. So it's half of the lowest median income in the U.S. So when we're talking about the luxury market, I'm talking about properties that cost $500,000 or more. Also, what we're seeing is that these people hoard properties that have been abandoned, or whose people are just desperate to be able to get some cash, and they start hoarding properties, and they sit on their investments. Also, we have an influx of recovery funds, and this figure that for me is the future of the housing justice conversation and the displacement conversation, which are low-income housing tax credit buildings, so that investors get their risk mitigated by the fact that the government is giving them an incentive, a tax break, so that they can invest in affordable housing, but for a specific period of time. So they just sit on their investment, and then they can raise the rent as far as they want to. When we're talking about an island that's becoming more and more elder, more impacted by climate change, we're talking about a recipe for future disasters that need to be mitigated in the future.
Thank you, Ariadna. So looking through the questions as they come in, a lot of you are asking, well, what do we do about it? And I think that is an extremely fair and extremely important question. Folks are saying, it feels sometimes the system, is preventing, real action and change against climate change. What are some things that folks can do right now? And this is a kind of a call to action, if you will, in their communities or globally, nationally. What can we do to create a system that will both fight climate change and better meet the housing needs of folks in our country and unincorporated territories that we have a lot of responsibility for.
Mm-hmm.
Who wants to go first?
I'll go. Yeah, it's an important question. First off, I mean, it does feel a little bit ridiculous. This has to be pointed out, but I would say vote for officials, politicians that believe in science and the climate crisis. That's just very easy. Vote, get people to vote. The second that is more real and practical in terms of on an individual level. As I said, the greatest insurance policy isn't the one that you write, it's the one that you have with your community members. So getting together with your community. The climate crisis is here. It's going to be felt everywhere in some capacity and others, some more than others. So as a way to prepare for that, strengthen your bonds with your neighbors. Have plans for, whatever variation of the crisis you might be facing, and have a plan in place. And then I would also say what we did in Paradise that identified a long-term recovery plan is we first talked about our values. And from there, we developed a vision. And this is in a fairly conservative community. This is Trump territory. And these are folks that talked about one of the biggest values in Paradise was nature. Another value was community. And so we identified a vision that put those at the heart of every decision we made as we rebuild. We have a long-term recovery plan that we revisit, projects that are implemented by the community, projects that are implemented by the town. So I would say that, for folks that are already experiencing disaster, coming together, talking about your values and visions for the future, and doing that even ahead of time as a way to prepare.
Thank you, Alan.
Yeah,
All right,
I
Jake.
would echo that. I think that it can't really be overstated how much, person-to-person interactions can matter for public education around issues that don't show up in the media that much, right? So everyone knows about the politics of climate change. Very few people know about the politics of flood insurance or managed retreat or, all that stuff. And I think that as much as the public education through PSA campaigns and stuff has been tried, you can do a lot by talking to people about that and by sort of trying to foster a community that's ready for those events. Like in the case of extreme heat, which we haven't talked about for obvious reasons, doesn't affect property. The number one thing that matters for someone's death in extreme heat, besides their access to air conditioning, is their social support network and whether there's anyone who's going to check on them if they're alone in their apartment and it's 100 degrees. But I think the other thing, right, is and it's sort of on the other thing that Alan said, is a lot of the issues that I think are the sort of political levers or fulcra that matter for this, they don't always get labeled as climate change, right? So I think California example, historically, public meetings about housing development, right, have been taken over by some of the worst actors in a given society in a lot of cases. And so I think being present at meetings about, whether they're gonna what your town is gonna do about the issue of homelessness, right? What they're gonna do about a new potential proposed affordable housing development, right? We've talked about how those things matter a lot for climate resilience. And I think that local participation, even beyond the voting for politicians who talk about climate change, obviously that's important, right? But the political participation actually can extend, I think, even farther beyond that, to things that aren't considered climate related, but they really matter for a specific place's resilience to those disasters.
Thanks, Jake. Sadia or Ariadna? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to maybe build off of all of these ideas in terms of talking to your neighbors, and I think and showing up to meetings, about sort of the new affordable housing development is also just look around and see who else is in the room. And you might find that a lot of people who could potentially be impacted are not there, right? And so I think as an, working at an organization for immigrant rights, like a lot of the materials that get sort of like circulated about prevention and resiliency and are only in English, right? And I think in families, the poorest of families, people with limited English proficiency, undocumented folks will be the people who are not in the room. And so I think, doing what we can to sort of advocate on the behalf of folks who are not there to advocate for themselves, and also sort of reaching out to neighbors and making sure they're part of the conversation is just really, really critically important, because there are so many people living in the shadows who climate disaster is going to disproportionately affect, and we have to make sure that they're a part of the conversation.
Thank you so much. Let's see, Ariadna, do you want to answer?
Yeah, I would say like something very specific, like the permanent authorization of CDBG DR funds, so that people just like could get like disaster assistance, and the universal form for disaster assistance requests, like like avoiding as many loopholes as we can. But I think that also integrating international human rights law, talking about racial discrimination and talking about frameworks of mitigation of disasters, connecting the U.S. to what's happening elsewhere. And thinking about it with a human rights perspective, it's going to be essential. And also, of course, the piece that has to do with participation.
Sorry, were one of you going to add something? Oh, that's okay. Yeah. So I think we only have a few minutes left, and we've talked about like some of the things that we can do, and the importance also of recognizing that this might be a conversation. This is an important conversation that needs to happen at the national level, the international reality of climate migration, and our current failures to adequately house, migrant folks, people who are applying for refugee status, that we're experiencing currently, that is not necessarily related to climate change, but is, a poor, it does not bear well for, future conversation, future crises, and how we're going to resolve them. Do any of you have any more thoughts about how to connect the work that we're doing to the global conversation? And I will say that this is an area that you can definitely expect more from Americans for Financial Reform Education Fund in the coming months on this also.
Yeah, I would say it is happening at some levels. Our group, Regenerating Paradise, is connecting with communities in Australia and Greece and Portugal as they face climate-driven wildfires, and talking about what we've learned, what's working, what isn't working. So yeah, that's definitely happening.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Any other last thoughts? We got 2 minutes left. Anything burning to say that I didn't ask you, or that you'd like to share with the audience as we leave? Great. Well, on that note, I would just like to thank, on behalf of Americans for Financial Reform Education Fund, I just want to thank so much all of our panelists today for being present and holding space, as well as to everyone from the public who came and joined today's conversation on housing displacement and climate change. So thank you once more to all of our speakers, Alan, Ariadna, Jake, and Sadia, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.